We've discussed Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 3, which took place at Friar Lawrence's cell. Now we move to Act 2, Scene 4, which takes place in a street in Verona. And we have Benvolio and Mercutio here. Now, if you follow the plot, and you have to realize that this is a scene that drives the plot, then you know that Benvolio and Mercutio were last seen together at the party, at the masked ball, at the Capulet's house. They have not seen Romeo since he gave them the slip. You'll remember that Romeo was all up in his feelings, and he climbed the orchard wall, and he looks down on Mercutio, and he says he jests at scars that never felt a wound, and then he climbs into the orchard. He should have known that was the Capulet's backyard. He had just gone around the corner. But anyway, Benvolio and Mercutio don't know where Romeo is, and in fact, they've gone to his house, or one of them has, and Benvolio actually had spoken to his servant and asked, "Where's Romeo?" And they said, "Well, he hasn't come home. He hasn't been home tonight." And immediately we find out that Mercutio believes that it's Rosalind. In lines 3 and 4, he says, "Ah, that same pale, hard-hearted wench, that Rosalind, torments him so that he will sure run mad." He's sure that the reason that Romeo is all lovesick still is that he's in love with Rosalind. And of course, they have no idea what's transpired the night before. They have no idea that Romeo has met Juliet. They know none of this. However, Benvolio does give us a hint into some foreshadowing into what's going to happen in the plot later. He says, "Tybalt, the kinsman of old Capulet, hath sent a letter to his father's house." And Mercutio says, "A challenge on my life." And Benvolio says with assurance, "Romeo will answer it." And this is when Mercutio goes into, this is also um, uh, this is character development. Mercutio is still perceived as the crazy guy that likes to make fun of people. He doesn't take anything seriously. This is what's going to lead to his eventual demise. Benvolio's the peacemaker. He's sincere. He likes Romeo. He's Romeo's probable best friend and cousin. And so he takes up for Romeo here. At one point, Mercutio starts making fun of Tybalt, even though we know that he knows Tybalt is dangerous. However, they still seem to think that it's Rosalind that is driving this love sickness of Romeo's. In fact, Mercutio says in line 15, "Stabbed with a white wench's black eye, shot through the ear with a love song, the very pin of his heart cleft with the blind boy's butt shaft." And is he a man to encounter Tybalt? He already shows us that he's concerned that if Romeo in his state of lovesickness encounters Tybalt, who is bent on revenge because Romeo disrespected his uncle's house the night before, which of course his uncle had said, "He seems like a goodly gentleman. All of Verona speaks well of him. Come on, Tybalt, don't cause a mutiny in my house." However, Tybalt left after having been roundly upbraided by his uncle and threatened Romeo's life. And so now we know that the next time Tybalt sees Romeo, he intends to kill him. And Mercutio, though he has no respect for much of anything, does know that Tybalt is dangerous and Romeo is in no shape. This alliteration, the blind boy's butt shaft, you have to be careful with that. That doesn't mean anything bad. It's just alliteration. A lot of B's, the blind boy's cubit, and the butt would be the butt of his arrow. However, there's probably a double entendre there somewhere. You go on later into the scene, and it's interesting because they're talking about Romeo, they're talking about his love sickness and Tybalt, and then Mercutio looks up. Actually, it's Benvolio, and Romeo comes running into the square. He cannot wait to tell his friends what has happened to him, and all of a sudden, Benvolio says, "Here comes Romeo, here comes Romeo." You'll remember, maybe, in Act 1, Scene 1, that when Benvolio and Romeo spoke after the fight between the Capulet servants and the Montague servants, Romeo said, "This is not Romeo, he's some other where." Romeo was so melancholy after having wandered around all night long and writing bad poetry that he honestly does not believe he's himself these days. Benvolio looks up and sees his friend, his cousin, come running into the square and realizes Romeo's back. Of course he's back. He's in love again, and this time the love loves him back. So we go down through the scene. There's a lot of this that you don't need to really understand. You can dig into it if you want. There's a lot of puns. There's a lot of kind of ribald, bawdy jokes. But in the end, what you basically see is these three friends. Remember when they went to the party? Mercutio was making fun of Romeo, and Romeo said, "It is no wit to go to this party." And Mercutio had asked why, might one asked, and Romeo had said, "Well, I dreamed a dream tonight." And that was when we had the whole Queen Mab speech, and Mercutio made fun of people who dream. And at the end of it, they stopped Mercutio and tell him, you got to calm down, Mercutio. You're kind of talking crazy here with this Queen Mab stuff. And Mercutio said, yes, I'm talking about dreamers. Dreamers often lie. And Romeo had said, in bed asleep where they dream things true. And what Romeo had dreamed was his own death because of this party. And of course, we know that that's going to be the truth. So anyway, here we have Romeo and the boys back together again, and they look up, and Romeo says, "Here's goodly gear, and here comes the nurse." Now we've seen the nurse before. We know why the nurse is here. Juliet in Act 2, Scene 2, in the what's called the balcony scene, had told Romeo that she would send someone the next day to see if he still intended to marry her, because she wanted to make sure that this was his intent. And so the nurse is here to get his assurance that he wants to marry her, but they're going to make fun of her. And so Mercutio says, a sail, as though she's as big as a ship. She's wearing this big white gown. And then Benvolio joins it and says, two, a shirt and a smock. And the nurse turns to her servant, which, you can't be any worse than the servant of the servant. And the nurse turns to her servant and says, my fan, Peter. She's going to act like a lady and fan her face. And Mercutio says, good Peter, to hide her face, for her fan's the fairer of the two. Now, this is dangerous ground for Romeo, because if the nurse decides to get angry and leave, then she may just go back to Juliet and say it was all a joke and Romeo never meant to marry you. He was not interested in it. And so Romeo kind of has to start pulling these boys back. And so he does. He pulls them back. And finally, the nurse says, and you've got to understand, the nurse tries to act like a lady. So she uses words that she thinks she knows what they mean. So she says to him in line 133, I think, if you be he, sir, meaning Romeo, I desire some confidence with you. Now, what she meant was a conference with you, but she says confidence. And then Benvolio starts making fun of Romeo. He says she will indict him to some supper, by which he means she will invite him, like she's going to ask him out on a date. And then Mercutio says, abad, abad, abad. So, and then they start making fun of the nurse again. The nurse kind of loses her wits, and Romeo has to get rid of the boys. Finally, he gets the nurse alone. And on line 182, Romeo says, nurse, commend me to thy lady and mistress. I protest unto thee. And he's about to say, commend me to thy lady and mistress. I protest unto thee, and tell her that I want to marry her. And the nurse says, okay, good heart and in faith I will tell her as much. Good Lord, she will be a joyful woman. And Romeo's like, what are you going to tell her? I haven't said anything. And finally, he says on line 191, bid her devise, that means plan, some means to come to shrift, that means confession, this afternoon, and there she shall at Friar Lawrence cell be shrived, which would be what the Catholics would do. You would go to confession, you'd be shrived and married. We know Romeo's not smart enough to make a plan like this. What's odd to me is that this is what Friar Lawrence has told Romeo to do. Tell Juliet to lie about coming to confession so we can marry her to you behind both of your parents' backs. And you'll remember the very first thing that Friar Lawrence said when we first saw him in his soliloquy, that there's sometimes you do things that are bad for the purpose of them being good, and sometimes things that you thought were for the good turn out to be bad. Well, it seems like this is Friar Lawrence's way of trying to make things right in his town. Well, anyway, then Romeo says in line 198, and stay, good nurse, behind the abbey wall. Within this hour my man, that's my servant, will be with thee and bring thee cords made like a tackled stair, which to the high-top gallant of my joy must be my convoy in the secret night. So the plan that Friar Lawrence has developed is that Romeo's servant will give the nurse a rope ladder that Juliet will have in her room. Later that evening, she'll throw the rope ladder over the balcony. Romeo will sneak back into the orchard like he had done the night before. He'll climb the rope ladder, and they will consummate their relationship. In other words, Friar Lawrence needs to make sure that this marriage can't be annulled. They have to actually not only be married in name, they have to be married in deed. And if you want to know more about that, you can look it up. At any rate, this is the plan. And it's interesting to me that the plan is one that Romeo could never have conceived. It had to have been made up by Friar Lawrence. And now Friar Lawrence and the nurse who are foils for one another. In other words, let's put it this way. The nurse is to Juliet as Friar Lawrence is to Romeo. They are both their older helpers, their confidants, the people to whom they always go to tell their secrets, and the ones that they feel like they can always trust. So the nurse is going to be Juliet's helper. She's going to get Juliet to the church. The nurse is going to have the rope ladder from Romeo's servant, and then Friar Lawrence, who is Romeo's servant, is going to, or helper, is going to perform the wedding.